Welcome to A Gallen of Questions. My name is Pat Gallen, and on today's show, we are again talking birds. It has been an interesting offseason. Lots of players leaving the nest after winning Super Bowl 59, and here to talk all things Eagles, EJ Smith from the Philadelphia Inquirer. EJ, are you getting any sleep these days? Are you back to like normal schedule?
Yeah, there's usually a couple of weeks in the off season where I don't do very much at all, and I think I finally am out of that phase. I feel like, we're starting to get back to a normal schedule. I'm definitely sleeping more now than I was during the playoff run, but no, it's all fun. The off season's a fun time. There's always something that keeps us busy.
You walk outside and go, "Oh my God, the sun! My eyes!"
I forgot what that was. Yeah, I forgot what it's like to experience nature. Yeah,
you definitely deserve that rest. It was certainly a long season. NFL's 12 months now, anyway. Here on this show, what we do is we put the questions in a silly little can that has stickers on it. It's called a Gallen of Questions. We pull them out and then we answer them to the best of our ability, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. Sound good?
Sounds great. Yeah.
All right, cool. EJ Smith, first time on the show. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, first question. Of all the moves made this offseason, which one has the best chance of being the biggest splash for the Eagles?
That's a good one. I guess we're only talking about free agency additions here. I couldn't be kind of sneaky and take an extension.
You want to go that? You can if you want. Sure. There's no rules on this show anyway. So.
Yeah, I'm going to take the Zach Bond extension. I feel like that was the Eagles' big move this offseason in a way, at least so far. If you look at it, I think it really changes the way that they're building their defense. For the longest time, certainly the 7 years that I've covered the team, my experience is that they have been able to kind of build a defense without investing very much at the linebacker position. They've divested resources from that position and put it into the defensive line, into the pass rush. And, that's been an effective formula for them. But I feel like in the last few years, we've seen Howie Roseman sort of evolve in a way and how he does build a roster. And I think one of the prime examples is, you look at offensively, they're paying, they have one of the highest paid running backs in the NFL. And on defense, now they have one of the highest paid linebackers. If I told an Eagles fan 5 years ago that was going to be the case, they wouldn't have believed me. So, I think that has been a really interesting move. I think that there have been some ripple effects. The CJ Gardner-Johnson trade, I feel like is probably in a way a byproduct of the fact that they need to get ahead of the way that this defense is built. They have a lot of talented players on rookie contracts. And then they have, again, like I said, Zach Bond as a very high value, but, they're paying for it at linebacker.
All right, three things. One, I can't believe that you've been covering the birds for 7 years. That seems crazy. Two, I think it is true, though, Howie zigs when the rest of the league zags, and then zags when the rest of the league zigs, and that's just how he's been. So, yeah, to tell me 10 years ago, 15 years ago that he would be this general manager, I think would be crazy. But of the moves, outside of the extensions, the contract stuff, what do you think would be the best move? They haven't made super splashy moves, but of those maybe smaller moves, which one maybe has the best chance of panning out?
Yeah, I think that Azeez Ojulari is probably the high upside one. I think that the rest of these guys I feel like are, very much bargain. I think they're trying to fill out the roster. And this is another thing we've seen Howie Roseman do in the past is he kind of doesn't want to go into the draft with any glaring needs. So he sort of like raises the floor at positions. I think a lot of the guys that they've signed, Dory Jackson, Josh O'Shea, some of these other guys, I feel like they all, AJ Dillon's another example. I feel like they kind of keep the team from needing something going into the draft. But, I feel like Azeez Ojulari is the one I look at who I do think could make a real impact. His problem has been staying on the field. When I watched his tape, I did a film review a few days ago, and when I watched his tape, you see a productive player, maybe not, an elite edge rusher in the NFL, but somebody who can get after the quarterback and somebody who can, affect the game, have an impact on a game. So, again, him being healthy is going to be the important part of this. I think, that's the big question mark with him. But if he can stay on the field, I think he helps the Eagles edge rusher rotation. I'd like to see them do more at that position, if I'm being honest, whether it's through the draft or in a trade. I think that there is room for them to continue to add to that position after losing Josh Sweat and obviously now Brandon Graham. But I do think that Azeez Ojulari is a type of like I said, floor raising player, that can also have a real upside to become even more than that.
Yeah, it's a great answer. That probably would have been my answer as well. Let's go to the next question here. Would you rather have 3 more healthy years of Saquon Barkley or have 6 straight Jalen Carter seasons like the one you just saw?
Ooh,
Only pick one.
That's a really good question. My first instinct is to go with Jalen Carter. I know how impactful Saquon Barkley was last year, but honestly, like, I think that Jalen Carter could be one of the best players in the NFL. I think that he can be. I mean, they're both like game wrecking players, right?
Yeah.
But I feel like the impact that you can have at defensive tackle is still such that it's he can really completely ruin a game plan every single week. I know people will say that Saquon Barkley can do the same thing, but I do think in general, like, if you told me that the Eagles didn't have elite play from Jalen Carter for the next, for next season, even let's just talk about next season. If you told me that they didn't have elite play from Jalen Carter next season, I'd be really curious what that defensive tackle rotation really looks like. The fact that they lost Milton Williams in free agency, I think we all are a little bit more confident that Jalen Carter is going to be able to figure it out for them.
Sure.
He plays so many snaps for that defense, and he really became so essential for that team, throughout especially the second half of the season and in the postseason. So, again, it's hard to go against Saquon Barkley.
Yeah.
I mean, he had an MVP caliber year, but I think the impact that Jalen Carter has on the defense as a whole.
Was this 2024 Eagles team the greatest in the history of the city? So we're talking all sports here. Can you think of a team that was maybe better than this iteration of the Eagles?
Yeah, some of those like late 2000s Phillies teams were really, really talented, and I like they hold a special place in my heart because I watched them growing up. But I think if you're just looking like pound for pound, like talent and accomplishment, this 2024 Eagles team is way up there. I think that they could make a case for being the best team, and at least in my, experience, watching Philadelphia sports. And at least, I don't want to talk about what happened before me. I wasn't as well versed on those things, but I do think in recent memory, at the very least, they have a really good case. I think the thing that's interesting is that like this Eagles defense, I feel like in 5 years from now, we're really going to appreciate guys like Quinyon Mitchell and Cooper DeJean, maybe even Jalix Hunt, Nolan Smith, and Jalen Carter. I think we have an appreciation for these guys now, but it's kind of one of those things where it snuck up on us a little bit because it's like, these guys, the legend kind of grew as the season progressed. And again, you'll look back at it, you'll be like, man, I can't believe they had all those guys on rookie contracts. I can't believe, that those guys were all on the same defense. I think that there's a chance that we could talk about that group in that way based off of how last season went. And I think that the more that we start to appreciate that, the more that I think we'll be able to realize just how good this team was. And the last thing, I wanted to point out is like, we were talking to Lane Johnson earlier, and, it really stands out to me, like listening to him talk, like this guy has, as great as this, generation of Eagles players is, like this guy has a chance to go down as one of the greatest offensive tackles, not only in Eagles history, but in NFL history. I mean, he's got 2 Super Bowls to his name, several All-Pros. And like, if he does play out this extension that he signed, which is another 3 seasons, like he might go down as the all-time leader in games played. He might be able to surpass Brandon Graham. It's going to take him staying healthy, but I just like it's hard to appreciate it in the moment. But when you zoom out, like they have some really, really legendary players that are kind of as a part of that team in that 2024 team. So I do think that's going to go down in history as one of the best in the city's history.
I asked Ray Didinger a similar question, and he said the 1949 Eagles because they had so much like Hall of Fame talent. I'm like, Ray, I'm not that old. Come on.
Yeah, I'll defer to Ray on that.
Yeah,
one. But as far as my experience, that they're definitely up there.
And some people would say maybe like the 83 Sixers, but I thought in 2022 that might be the most talented Eagles team we would ever see. And then somehow they were able to top that this year. So the talent level right now is extraordinary. Scale of 1 to 10, EJ, what's your level of excitement for March Madness?
It's like a 6, It's not as much as I used to love it, but I mean, it is hard to argue with like college basketball on TV 24/7. There's something special about that. I don't have as much of knowledge about college basketball as I used to, but I'll be honest, like sometimes I think that makes it even more fun is when you don't know. Cause like my wife is like talking to me about the bracket, right? And I'm like, honestly, your bracket will be as good as some like total experts, people who really live and breathe college basketball. So I think that that's kind of what makes it fun. It's an enjoyable time for sure.
I was watching that Alabama State St. Francis game at the end, and I said to my wife, I'm like, get over here, watch this. You got to watch this replay at the end of the game. Like these two teams, I have no idea where they're, where they are, who they are on the team, but it's still so magical. I love this time of year. Now that BG is gone, who will be the go-to guy in the Eagles locker room for a great quote?
Ooh, that's a good one. There are some good, some reliable quotes in the Eagles locker room. Lane is definitely up there. I think that he's the first one that comes to mind.
Yeah.
Saquon's very reliable, but he doesn't have the same BG level of like, silliness or, like he's not going to get you. He's not going to make you laugh. He's just going to he's going to be very helpful. I think Lane's the first one that comes to mind. He's pretty funny, in most interview settings. I'm curious to hear who you think now, because, Lane was the first one that came to my mind, at least.
First one that came to mind would be Jordan Mailata.
Yeah,
because he can kind of do both. He can kind of make you laugh. He can get serious about it. He can be a little more like toward the end here with BG. Not that he wasn't serious, but Jordan has a little bit more, I think, of like an edge, a serious side. But I would probably say Mailata.
Yeah, I think that's a good one. He definitely has that silly side to him when he wants to bring it out. Yeah. But it's really been fascinating to watch him emerge as a leader, on the team, and I think that's where that seriousness is starting to come from for him.
100%. All right, we got some good answers here. All right, I'm gonna make you work here for this one, EJ. Grade the moves. Let's start. We got 4 of them here. Grade the moves. C.J. Gardner-Johnson trade. What grade would you give it?
I'm going to give that one a C. That is like a wait and see. Maybe that's why I'll give it a C, a wait and see.
Wait and see.
I would like to know what their plan is at safety. I'm sure Howie Roseman would tell us that this is early in the offseason. They don't have to play a game anytime soon. If you're telling me that you're going out there with, Sidney Brown and Reed Blankenship as the 2 starting safeties, I'm a little worried about that, especially because, this isn't a Jim Schwartz defense where the safeties can kind of be, insulated a little bit. Like Vic Fangio, like he asks a lot of his safeties. It's a very important role in that defense. So I'm curious to see what they do at that position. So right now I'd give it a C. If you told me that they drafted, maybe like a Malachi Starks out of Georgia or, a player that could really kind of fill that CJ Gardner-Johnson role, I think I'd be more toward a B or a B plus, because I understand the rationale behind the move, the finances behind it. But, as far as the on-field product, I am still curious what they're going to be able to do at that spot.
Kenny Pickett trade.
Yeah, I'm going to give that one an A. I think that, no offense to Kenny Pickett here, but, I think that we saw last year that Tanner McKee was good enough to be the Eagles' number 2 quarterback. And, we know the Eagles value that position, and they wanted somebody with experience at that spot. But at this point, especially with how much, we were just talking about the finances of the CJ Gardner-Johnson trade, I think staying, cheap with a quarterback on a rookie deal at that number 2 spot makes a lot of sense, especially because I think Tanner McKee is a good quarterback. Like, I think that he, has earned that job, and I don't have very many reservations about if Jalen Hurts were to miss a couple of games. I think Tanner McKee could step in and do just fine. So to get a draft pick back for Kenny Pickett, I think it made a lot of sense. I remember when I did the draft value charts, it was pretty much a wash from year to year. The trade to get him and the trade, to send him to Cleveland. So, I think it makes a lot of sense. And, you get Dorian Thompson-Robinson in the trade too. I think that made sense as well.
I'm going to guess you're going to give this an A, but the Zach Bond contract, do you give that an A grade?
Yeah, I'm going to give that an A. I think if that was the one player, I really struggled with like the Milton Williams versus Zach Bond, if you could only re-sign one debate. And I settled on Zach Bond because I just felt like, again, the level of importance he had for the defense, the versatility that he had. Yeah. Milton Williams is a really good player, and it's very important to have like that number 2 defensive tackle to kind of be able to divest, take advantage of some of the attention that Jalen Carter draws. But I think Moro Ajuma, I think he is in a good spot. I think he's a player that could step into that role. I think they could add to that role through the draft. I think keeping Zach Bond in the fold, I think is really important for kind of keeping this Eagles defense as dominant as it was last year. I think it's hard to envision this Eagles defense without Zach Bond, I think is the best way to say it.
Last one, the Saquon extension.
Yeah, I'm going to give that one a B or a B plus. I mean, okay. I think it made a lot of sense to reward him for the season that he had. I think it was smart to get ahead of it. The Eagles have always been, they like to err on the side of doing these deals early because the price really only goes up for these types of deals. I think it was almost like you're rewarding a player a little bit earlier than you have to. So I'm not going to give it an A or an A plus. It's like you're paying a guy more money when finances are tight, but at the same time, I totally understand the rationale. And I think it is, a smart way to do business with players, of that caliber for sure.
All right, next question for EJ. As quickly as you can, in layman's terms, explain the salary cap in the NFL. Is it real?
Yeah. So what I would say is the salary cap is real, but there are a lot of ways to circumvent the salary cap, and the
Yep.
Eagles are very good at doing that. And when I say circumvent, I think it's really they're leveraging their future years to win now, and they're banking on the fact that like the salary cap progressively goes up. So
Yep.
it's just like most people, when you take out a loan, like you're paying interest on that loan, and the dollars aren't really going to be cheaper in the future. But with the salary cap, because the cap goes up, they like to borrow money from future years when those dollars should be theoretically cheaper. So it gets very confusing. You're looking at like void years on contracts, but the best, and like the last thing I would say, explaining the salary cap to somebody, kind of like and explain it to me like I'm 5, is when they add the void years and they basically make the contract longer, they can spread out how that contract affects that 1 year. It's called I guess it's called proration or amortization. These are words that I'm not as well versed on, and I didn't go to school for finance, but basically the only thing that I would say to people is like, in order to do that, in order to spread that money out over the course of a longer time, you have to be willing to pay the cash up front.
Yep.
And that requires an owner that's willing to do that. And there are a lot of owners across the league who don't want to do that. But the Eagles are typically among the league leaders in cash spent, which again helps them kind of just ease the salary cap, tightness sometimes.
Sure.
So, I think the Eagles do a good job of managing it. It definitely has risks involved, but again, as long as the salary cap kind of stays on this upward course, I think they are doing something that gives them an advantage.
Look, I gave up in 6th grade algebra, so thank you for that. Quick rank them here. BG's laugh, Nick Sirianni's one-liners, A.J. Brown's love of books, or Landon Dickerson's riding mower appreciation.
Oh, well, that is a soft spot in my heart because I am a lawnmower enthusiast. So
you could put that at the top if you want.
I'm gonna go BG's laugh first.
Okay.
He is. I was saying this yesterday. Like he is like. We cover a lot of special individuals. To make it to the NFL is extraordinary in and of itself. And he stands out among that group because he is just such a special person. So I got to give him number 1. Okay. I'm going to give Landon's riding mower appreciation number 2 because as someone who, I was just looking at my grass the other day. I'm like, oh, it's starting to green up. I'm going to be on the mower again soon.
Look at
it's very, meditative. If you haven't tried it, I recommend it to all the people out there.
I like that.
And then what were my other 2? So Nick Sirianni's one-liners.
Yep.
And then what else?
AJ's love of books.
Well, listen, I got to give AJ's love of books number 3 because he shouted out my colleague Mike Sealski's book Rise, which actually is right behind me. I think it's literally right back here. So shout out to Sealski. So shout out to AJ as well. So he gets number 3. Nick Sirianni's one-liners, he gets number 4. It's no shade intended, but that's going to be in the last spot.
I love the riding mower. See, I don't have any grass. I live in South Philly, so I don't get that. I don't get the suburban grass like you have. So enjoy. Looking at the roster, who's the one player here from last year primed for a breakout this coming year?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm going to go Keely Ringo. I kind of have been leading like the Keely Ringo belief train for a while now. I really do think that I think people sometimes forget he's younger than Quinyon Mitchell still.
Yeah.
And
that's crazy.
Yeah, and like he has all the physical traits to be a very, very good cornerback in the NFL. He's big, he's fast, and I think the biggest thing that he needed to work on coming out of Georgia was just technique and kind of being more, comfortable in his position. I remember talking to some of his coaches at Georgia when he got drafted, and they mentioned that he was late to come over to the cornerback position. He got injured for part of his time in Georgia, so he just didn't have a lot of reps. But I think, the last couple of years, especially last year working with Christian Parker, behind the scenes, I think he really could have, I think that he could be a very competent starter. I think, when you look at that cornerback spot where Darius Slay and James Bradbury are obviously out the door, I think that if Keely Ringo can reach some of that potential, and I think his potential is huge. I think he has, honestly, this might be a hot take. I think that his ceiling could be about as high as Quinyon Mitchell's ceiling. I think that he could be that good just because of the physical traits that he has. So I think the biggest hurdle for him is going to be technique. It's going to be playing the position the way that Quinyon Mitchell plays the position with excellent technique, the way that we've seen him play. So I think that it's going to take a lot, but I do think that there's a real world here where he is a very, very good starter for the Eagles.
EJ, it's not even lunchtime. I'm not ready for that kind of spice yet. That's heat right there.
I should
we got
give
two
an
more
honorable
questions.
mention to Moro Ajama because I think he's also very good, and I think he could step into a really
He's
big
sneaky
role this
good.
year.
The last one, Brandon Graham retired this week. Where does he rank among the most important Eagles players of the last 25 years? Got to be up there.
Yeah, he's definitely up there. I can't give you an exact number, but he's the all-time leader in games played. I mean, you think about the strip sack in Super Bowl 57, or 52, excuse me. He is immensely important. It's funny, I was thinking about this yesterday. His stats aren't like eye-popping.
Right.
Like, you're not looking at, like I said, like, he's an Eagles Hall of Famer, not a Hall of Famer. But, I do think, like, when watching him, I watched him as a fan when I was a kid, and now, been covering him for the last, several years. Like, I feel like his play was greater than the numbers would suggest. I think he'll have an appreciation from Eagles fans because of just like the effort that he played with, and the impact he had on games, even if it wasn't necessarily sack production or tackles for loss. I mean, he's been a rock solid player for a really long time for this team. So he definitely ranks up there. He's probably in like, maybe not that first tier of like, surefire Hall of Famers. You think of Jason Kelsey, you think of Lane Johnson if he continues on the track that he's been on, but that next tier of players. And I mean, honestly, there's the intangible part of it too. The impact he has in the
word
locker
I was going to say. Yep.
Yeah. So I think he is, maybe he is in that tier one, honestly, now that I'm thinking about that. He is, it's hard to envision the Eagles without Brandon Graham at this point.
He's like a Hall of Fame intangibles guy, always in the right place, great leader. You never saw him get blown up on a block or anything like that. Just steady presence, great guy, great human being. Certainly going to miss him, and his laugh, of course. EJ Smith, thank you so much, my friend. That was fantastic. Always great to catch up with you, dude.